Welcome to Hashtag Trending, the weekend edition. There's something satisfying about reading an article that a friend passes on to you, even in the middle of a busy day, and you say, hey, I have to read this. And the title of this article was, How Worried Should We Be? So I read it and I thought, wow. And then I looked at it and I realized my friend hadn't just passed on a great article, she wrote it. Now, I shouldn't be surprised. Samantha Liscio has been articulate and thoughtful in all the time I've known her. We've had great conversations in the past on a variety of subjects, and she's had numerous accomplishments in her career. Before she left Canada to work overseas, I was able to present her with the CIO of the Year award from IT World Canada and the Canadian CIO Association. So, as I said, I wasn't surprised, but I knew, because how she was a friend, I could drop her a note and talk to her about this article and this important subject. The bonus is you get to listen in. My guest is my friend Samantha Liscio. Welcome, Sam.
Pleasure to be here, Jim, and a pleasure to be chatting about all things technology again with you.
Yeah, and I really did mean that I wanted to catch up. You're always doing something exciting. Like, what are you up to now?
Well, as you know, I've been in the UK since I moved during COVID, so almost 4 years now in the United Kingdom. And I finished as a full-time CIO last December, and I've started a portfolio career. So some CIO advisory work and some work as a non-executive director with one of the biggest hospital trusts, the NHS Foundation trusts here in the UK. So a bit of a different perspective on the governance side of things, but really exciting.
Yeah, and if anybody heard me say, oh my God, it's been 4 years? I can't believe it. That's astonishing.
Yeah, COVID put that kind of stop clock on things. It's really difficult to think about things pre-COVID and think we're talking almost 5 years ago. Incredible.
Yeah, yeah. Now, this article, as I pointed out, does have a disturbing title. How worried should we be? What inspired you to write this?
Thinking about all of the different cyber attacks that we hear about, and you and I in the IT function hear about those quite frequently. And I'm sure your listeners hear about those, whether they're technology professionals or not, because it impacts all of us. When we think about where our data is and recent data breaches and ransomware as it applies to big financial services companies with regard to financial data, and within the health sector as it relates to personal health information. We all get very worried when we hear about those breaches, and they seem to be happening more and more often. And as things like AI start to take part of the common psyche, we start to worry even more about what that might look like in the hands of people that want to do bad things with our information. So hearing those more recent issues in relation to data breaches and ransomware, and then thinking, as I do from a governance perspective in a large hospital trust, what that means when you have multiple interconnected devices, multiple interconnected systems, and many different stakeholders that are engaged as partners in that service chain. So that made me think about really how worried as a technology or security professional should we be, but how worried should we be as people and patients?
Yesterday, I did a story, and I don't know when we'll broadcast this, so maybe a couple days in the past, but I did a story yesterday on 800 surgeries canceled in London because of an attack, a cyber attack. But so far, these attacks mostly are on the administrative systems, but even that impact has been terrifying.
Indeed, but when you think that to more and more the administrative systems are interconnected with all of those other systems. So in order to run a big hospital, you need to know what's happening. So you need to know who's connected to which infusion pump and when they're getting that medication, and to make sure that their clinicians are advised appropriately of that. As you're moving people from wards into surgery, as you're moving them from surgery into recovery, you need to know where everyone is and what's happening to them, where your medications are, how they're getting deployed and administered. And all of that administration is happening with devices that are connected as well. So you've got this really broad Internet of Things, infusion pumps, IV pumps, that are all connected to that administration system too. So if you have a hack that happens, it's not insurmountable that you can have access to those devices as well as the data in the systems. So because of that interconnectivity, we need to be worried about the devices being targeted to be able to access the administration systems. And then when you do have a hack, of people being able to take control of those devices as well.
A light just went on as I was talking to you. It's so funny. We've talked about this before, but just we talk about companies, for-profit companies being software companies that are now delivering a product or service. And it just, as you were saying that, I went, we're talking about a technology infrastructure that helps deliver healthcare. And just the realization hit me.
Yeah, and sometimes the example that you used about the surgeries being cancelled was related to an issue that happened with a hack related to an outsourced pathology system. So nothing related to the scheduling of surgery or the theaters themselves, but because of the interconnectivity, the impacts are more broad ranging.
And one of the things that scares me with all of these dependencies, with all of this that affects the healthcare of people, in Canada at least, there seems to be no overall coordination. Everyone is off on their own, from tiny little hospitals to government agencies to clinics. It doesn't seem coordinated. They're inventing it each time for themselves. Is that the sense you get as well?
Well, I think with the best of intentions, everybody wants to be able to digitize and to take what is, paper or manual information and to be able to secure that properly and to be able to have it accessible by the people that need access to it when they need access to it. But because in Canada, as in the UK, healthcare is socially funded and nationally administered, there are ways that that has to be funded that aren't always consistent or system wide. So it's very difficult when you have a system that has organically grown over the last 15, 20, 25 years to be able to get the necessary funding to be able to invest in that where you need to. And because all of those things have grown kind of organically, we don't have necessarily those common standards basis by which we can start to develop. We haven't really agreed the gauge of the railways, and we need to start to integrate all of these different regional and local railways together to be able to have that data transit the system broadly. So
Yeah.
it's a big problem.
And with the system being like that, it was already challenged. I mean, to meet the demands of an aging population in Canada, the lack of staff, the always tight budgets, healthcare didn't need one more challenge.
No, and we wring our hands sometimes about the state of healthcare and we talk about it, healthcare is broken, we need some fundamental fixes. But oftentimes we forget that we're servicing many more people in many different ways than we ever have before. And post-pandemic, that's true in the United Kingdom as it is in Canada. Doing much more in terms of health for people, much more diagnostic tests earlier, interventions and treatments earlier, many more people engaged in the healthcare system than ever before. And being able to support that when you have an infrastructure that's older and hasn't been designed as fit for that modern purpose, you really do struggle.
And your article points out a new area for many of us that I don't think we've considered or we've really heard about. And that's the area of the operational devices that are used in a hospital. Can you tell us a little bit about those and why they're so vulnerable?
Yeah, so I started thinking about this actually at a CISO summit, a Chief Information Security Officer symposium a couple of months ago. And a lot of the chat around the tables there with the CISOs related to manufacturing operations and the Internet of Things and how those devices are a target for cyber actors. And then it got me thinking about in the hospital, the healthcare setting, how are those managed and what view do the CIO and the CISO have in those? When you often have a bit of a segmentation in hospitals where the operations team and the IT team are separate. And because a lot of these devices have software on them, who then has accountability for making sure that they're patched properly or that they're updated when they go in for regular maintenance and calibration? And the more I started to look into that, the more I think there's a bit of a gap between the work that the operations team do, which is really important work with regard to regular maintenance of equipment, making sure that devices are calibrated properly and adhering to all of those necessary standards, but then not always working with the IT team when those standards on the IT side require appropriate management of end of life, making sure things can get patched and critical patch deployment can happen on those things too. So those two things aren't happening together always. And I think there's a bit of a gap from a risk perspective when a board looks at the overall risk associated with their operations environment or with their IT environment. It kind of falls between those two stools.
And one of the first time I saw a medical device in a hacking experiment was a drip pump, and it was just a simple Linux operating system. I could have hacked it, and I'm not that good.
Yeah, Linux or, Windows XP with the Windows, can't, we haven't been able to patch some of that Windows stuff since 2013. And many of those devices are on that type of operating system. And worse than that, they retain security keys. And then when you think about they are fungible assets, so they have value in a secondhand marketplace. If those assets move from the original institutional owner, they still have an asset tag on them and they retain security keys. It's not really difficult to triangulate those things together for a hacker to be able to then access systems and be able to deploy malware. And that's a really big worry.
Wow. And so they could identify the organization. They have access to the system. They have access to passwords. And the scary thing is these things are sitting on networks.
Yeah, when they're connected and because they're mobile devices, you mentioned the infusion pumps. At any point in time in a busy hospital setting, there could be hundreds of those mobile devices on trolleys. You don't even necessarily know physically where they are.
Wow. So what's the plan? You have to update these devices. You have to manage them. But this is a huge change in how these devices are purchased and maintained, I would think.
Not necessarily a huge change, but that the oversight on the maintenance and calibration work that has to be done needs to include that software hygiene as well. And that hasn't always been the case.
What's interesting, and this is what I like when I'm talking to you, you talked about this in your article, not as a technical problem, but almost as if it's a cultural problem. Why is that?
Well, I think in cybersecurity, it all comes down to human behavior. We can put the best predictive technology in place to help us in regard to how we respond to penetration attacks. But when those penetration attacks are because people click on malicious links or they're subject to phishing, it's really about educating people to feel safe enough to be able to put their hand up to say, look, something doesn't look right here and we need to fix that, rather than blaming them or being punitive when things go wrong or they're exploited, because the exploitation becomes more and more sophisticated. And anybody can be fooled on any day of the week, especially if you're a busy clinician that really doesn't have the time to be able to get them lunch or visit the bathroom, let alone figure out that they have to reset their complex password and do multi-factor authentication. So it's being able to establish those trust relationships with people, and that there is, you're helping people do the right thing. Is that whole idea of behavioral nudging, make it easy for people to do the right thing, or they'll find a way around doing the right thing, which creates more problems.
And I love this idea of nudging you put into the article. And I'll put a link to the article so people can read it as well. But the classic response in a case like this would be, let's draft up some procedures. Let's get some commandments. Let's tell everybody, let's kick ass and take names, and we'll put some rules in and that'll fix it. You don't think that's going to fix the situation. And you talk about this idea of nudging. Can you tell me what you mean by that and why you think it'll work better than the idea of putting in procedures, rules, and cracking a whip?
Yeah, I think the procedures and rules are vitally important. can't exist without those. And adherence to standards is vitally important too, whether that's your ISO 27001 or your Cyber Essentials Plus, or all of those things that you do to make sure that you can demonstrate that you're safeguarding things the way you should. But you can do all of that if you don't win the hearts and minds of people around making sure that everything that they do when they engage in a networked way is looking out for those discontinuities that could mean that something bad's happening. You have to do both in consort. And that's where the behavioral people side of things becomes really, really important. So it's making people realize what that nightmare scenario might look like for them and for their company. But that if they can get on top of that early, then it shouldn't be anything that reflects poorly on them. So if I'm subject to a phishing attack, I've looked at something, it looks legitimate. I've done all of those checks and balances because I've looked at the training, but still I'm fooled. I need to feel safe enough that I can raise that to the attention of my IT support folks and the organization to say, look, I clicked on this. I didn't know it's my bad, but it's better that the organization know that immediately so that they can act on it. And if I'm punished for that, I'm not likely going to do it. So it needs to be that trust-based relationship that gets built.
Yeah, and I think that's applicable everywhere in cybersecurity. I think people are coming to that realization that if there's going to be a punishment for a mistake, you're not going to hear about mistakes. That's just a fact of human nature.
Yeah, it's much, much more easy to deal with situations when they're reported early. But if it goes on or someone tries to hide the fact that that mistake has been made, it just compounds the problem. And then you've got infiltration that you don't know about, and it can be days before you find that out, and it becomes a much, much bigger issue.
Yeah. And this behavioral nudging, I know you believe it. I don't think people should dismiss it. I read a study, this is ages ago, but people were trying to improve the outcomes for operations in operating theaters. And one of the biggest things they correlated to successful outcomes was whether the team introduced themselves at the beginning. These nudges, these behavioral things that people do aren't always as obvious as one might think.
Or they're so blindingly obvious we take them for granted. It's like those bacterial resistant diseases in hospitals, MSRA, you hear spoken about. And the biggest solution to those is regular, frequent hand washing. So putting hand wash stations in the right places, putting signs where people will be encouraged to go and wash their hand really changes things. And it's that prompting that behavior at that right time when people are in the moment and inclined to do that it becomes second nature and the blinding obvious becomes done. And then we don't have those problems.
Love that. Sometimes it's the obvious things. In that light, do you see some hopeful signs that people are tackling these problems?
I think so. In healthcare, there's much more of a focus now and a systems-wide focus, an end-to-end focus on things where there are potentials for outcomes that are difficult to trace back. And as we start to get more of those integrated systems and that integrated data, there's loads of decision quality information and is getting exposed in ways that we haven't been able to see those patterns before. So I'm very, very hopeful that we'll start to see some of these gaps. So where we have devices and we're not doing the software patching when we're doing the regular maintenance, that's an easy fix. So we can start to do that and do that as a matter of course. And that in doing that, it stops a problem happening and snowballing that becomes something different later that then potentially has poor patient outcomes associated with that. I'm reading a book right now called Black Box Thinking. And it's all about how having black box on an aircraft and then the use of the data afterwards is used to benefit the entire industry. And how healthcare is adopting more of that black box thinking approach to when there are issues that happen with bad outcomes. So it's less about the entrenching and the organization or institution thinking about brand reputation and protection of that, and more about what systemically do we need to do to change so that this doesn't happen in the future. So it's that building that safety to be able to discuss transparently when things don't go right so that you can fix them for the future. And it's fascinating.
Yeah, we talk a lot about data and the use of data, but the black box is a perfect motif for this. Those people actually go look at the data and look for ways to change how they behave and how they do things based on the data, not just admiring the problem.
Yeah, one of the really good use cases in the book about healthcare is in relation to IV pumps, diffusion pumps, the way those drugs are administered. And in one manufacturer, when you turn the dial to the right, it turns it up, and in another manufacturer, you turn it to the right, it turns it down. So if you have busy clinicians and they're not paying attention to the fact that this is one manufacturer versus the other, they're doing the exact opposite of what they intend to do. So just making those things consistent across and having those systematic standards-based processes makes things so much easier when it comes to those intuitive behaviors. But finding something like that out, then you can draw attention to it. And then people think twice before they do what they intend to do. They'll check that that's actually going to have the outcomes that they want to have.
I go back to your earlier comment. When you look at it in that aspect, it's so obvious.
Yeah, just
Amazing.
change the things that are making it difficult for people to do the right.
Nudge them a little. Uh, you also pointed out in an earlier conversation I had with you that some of the legislation is changing. And I had to go to somebody in the UK to find out what was happening in Canada. You said that there's some hope on the government side as well in terms of how people are moving forward.
Yeah. So when I talk about the need for standardization, what's really important is that the legislation promotes that standardization too. And the federal government in Canada, I think 2 weeks ago now, a couple of weeks ago, had announced a new health bill to secure patient health data. And boiled down to its most simple essence, it's collect once and use many times. Because there are many, even though the privacy legislation is permissive, when you build privacy by design in terms of your access to systems, oftentimes it gets in the way of being able to do what you need to do. So you don't want to be showing up in the emergency room and a doctor can't access your information because they don't have the express right to do that at the time that they need to. So we need some of those provisions in healthcare. And I think that new legislation is certainly getting to the heart of what has been some of the impediments to being able to share that information in the past, which is fantastic. And I think will help with that. What are the standards that we need to think about with regard to health data? And how do we make sure that we can share that information to the people that need to access that when they need to access it and maintain the security and privacy that we've come to depend upon? And in Canada and the UK, we're very good at it. We have really strong healthcare systems with very strong privacy and security built in.
And unlike the American systems and other systems, we have the capacity to share that information if we make it possible. That should be the huge strength of Canadian medicine and possibly UK medicine as well.
Yeah, and I think putting patients in control of their data and how that's used and democratizing that whole data consent and consent management. And in the UK, through the NHS app, that's starting to happen, whereby people can take control of their own data and how that gets accessed and managed, just by setting some check marks against that. Do you want to be able to share your data? For which purposes? And then we'll come back. You can change that at any point, and then you can kind of restrict it as you go down some of those decision criteria. But at the very heart of that, it's you have the decision and the right to decide if that data gets shared and by whom and when.
So we started out the conversation with how worried should we be. I'm ending it with maybe we could be a little hopeful here. Is that possible?
I think so. I think there's lots to take in a really positive way and to think about the future in a very happy light. And that I think a lot of that is when you think about AI and some of the nightmare scenarios, and we all think about Terminator and the machines taking over, AI can actually help us identify some of those patterns where there are some of those gaps. And in the article, we talk about the medical devices and that being a gap, operation technology without MT. Once we start to plug those gaps and then wrap around that, nudging on the right behaviors with all of the people that are engaged in that system, we really do start to pull it all together in an end-to-end way. So I'm really hopeful for that. I think AI is really going to help with that end-to-end discoverability from an IT tech kind of perspective. But then as a patient or a consumer of data, knowing that I have control of that and I can be able to change that at any point in time is reassuring as well.
I always feel better after having talked to you. My guest today has been Samantha Liscio. Thank you, Sam. Thanks for coming by.
Pleasure, Jim, as always. Thank you.
And thank you for spending part of your weekend with us. Hashtag Trending goes to air 5 days a week with a daily news show, and every weekend we have an interview and a feature show we call the Weekend Edition. You can get us anywhere you get audio podcasts. We're also on YouTube with a video version as well, and you can find that on our Tech Newsday channel. And let your friends know about us. We're approaching 1,900,000 downloads, and I want to take us to 2 million. So call your friends, let them know. Tell them to check out the podcast. The show notes are at technewsday.ca or .com. Take your pick, and you can find links to some of the things we talked about right there. I'm your host, Jim Love. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and I'll talk to you on Monday with the latest in tech news.